Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com, and this is anti-war news for Friday, October 7th, 2022. This is the last show for the week. I'll be back after the weekend, and this weekend on Saturday, I'm going to be at the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. at a rally for Julian Assange. You guys should attend if you can. It's from 12 to 3. I'll go over more details about that at the end of the show. But for now, we have lots of news, and I wish I had good news for you. But the first story at the top of the page today, President Biden says that the risk of nuclear Armageddon is the highest it's been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, this is a rare admission from President Biden of the danger of his policy of supporting Ukraine in a war on Russia's border. Biden said that Putin is, quote, not joking when he talks about the use of tactical nuclear weapons, end quote. And what he said was pretty interesting that he can't imagine the use of a tactical nuclear weapon not leading to Armageddon. So, tactical nuclear weapons have smaller nuclear yields than strategic nuclear weapons, which could take out, entire cities. But many of these tactical nukes, the smaller ones, are still comparable to the bombs that the U.S. dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But there's been kind of this attitude in Washington and in the think tank world and stuff that we could potentially use these the tactical nuclear weapons in a war, and it wouldn't lead to annihilation. But apparently, Biden doesn't think that. He said, "quote I don't think there is any such." Sorry, it's a kind of a jumbled quote. I don't. There is any such a thing as the ability to easily use a tactical nuclear weapon and not end up with Armageddon. End quote. Um, so he said this at a fundraiser in New York City. He was speaking to donors. He went on, quote, "We have not faced the prospect of Armageddon since Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis," end quote. So he said that referring to JFK, President John F. Kennedy. And Kennedy diffused the Cuban Missile Crisis by negotiating with Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader at the time, and cutting a secret deal to remove U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey that were armed with nuclear warheads. And Kennedy also gave assurances that he would not invade Cuba, and in exchange, the Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba. So at this point, there's no indication that Biden and Putin have been holding any negotiations, but back channel talks are always possible. Since Russia invaded Ukraine, the U.S. has shown no interest in diplomacy and virtually cut off all high level public talks. Blinken spoke with Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, once, and it was about a prisoner swap. But I mean, in a way, it's Biden, so who knows if this was scripted or off the cuff or if he means it or. But this is something we've heard a lot of people been saying, a lot of other officials and experts, and myself, and that right now we are at the highest risk of nuclear war than the Cuban Missile Crisis, and potentially at any time, could be even higher right now. Because as John Mearsheimer has said, it's like the Cuban Missile Crisis, but Kennedy is not speaking with Khrushchev. But again, there could be back channel talks going on. So I would think, no matter how horrible Biden is, because it's his policies that brought us here of arming Ukraine and supporting this war. Um, it's if he's recognizes that the danger is this high, you would think he's got to be doing something about it. There's got to be some kind of back channel talks, because all publicly, every Biden administration official has said that they're not going to back down. They're not going to change support for Ukraine, even amid this talk of nuclear weapons use and Putin's warnings and threats to the West. So, but the next one is related. Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, calls for NATO to launch a preemptive strike on Russia. So maybe Biden saw this, and that's when after he made his comments after. But this is so I saw this going around on Twitter. There's a video of Zelensky saying this with subtitles, and I thought I kind of waited a little while before I wrote anything about it just to make sure that was the right translation. But it looks like it was. So Zelensky, he called to launch a preemptive strike on Russia he called for NATO to do it to prevent Moscow from using nuclear weapons. And that's something that would almost certainly spark World War III and possibly, almost certainly, nuclear war. So this is the quote. I'm going to just try to read it. It's a little jumbled, but he said, "What should NATO do? Exclude the possibility of use of nuclear weapons by Russia. But the most important, I'm again addressing the international community, is how it was before February 24th. Preventative strikes so that they know what will happen if they use a nuclear weapon. And not the opposite, waiting for Russia to strike and then saying, oh, that's how you are. Now you can take it from us. Reconsider how you apply pressure, the order of application." End quote. So um, the Kremlin immediately jumped on these comments and said that Zelensky was trying to spark a world war. Ukrainian officials tried to downplay what Zelensky said. And this was another reason why I waited a little while, because it seemed like maybe they were saying it was mistranslated or they were walking it back. But his advisors said that he said nothing about a preventative nuclear strike, because some people were saying Zelensky calls for the U.S. to launch a nuclear strike on Russia, a preventative nuclear strike. But maybe that did kind of sound like that's what he was insinuating, but that was kind of the clarification. And then his press secretary appeared to try to walk it back a little more. He said that Zelensky was speaking about the period before February 24th, and preventative measures should have been used at that time. And he's saying that it was sanctions he was talking about. But I mean, he said strikes, at least that's what the translation is. So, but what Zelensky is saying is that, the U.S. imposed these sanctions that it's been hitting Russia with after February 24th. I guess maybe he was saying they should have done it before. But either way, I mean, he's saying strikes. And Zelensky, this isn't anything new for Zelensky. He's previously called for direct U.S. and NATO military intervention in the conflict. Earlier in the war, he pushed really hard for this no-fly zone, for the U.S. and NATO to impose a no-fly zone, which would have involved shooting down Russian warplanes and bombing surface-to-air missile systems inside Russia. World War III. That's what he was calling for. So this isn't anything new from him, really. But the next one, now this is a big story, and it came from a strange place. U.S. Special Operations Forces are on the ground in Ukraine, and that this is according to a report from The Intercept, and the authors are James Risen and Ken Klippenstein. I know Risen was a big Russiagator, and normally I wouldn't be citing his work, but this report said, according to unnamed U.S. intelligence and military officials, that there are special operations forces, U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine as part of a broad covert operation that includes CIA personnel. And the report said that the U.S. withdrew its CIA and special operations assets from Ukraine shortly before Russia's invasion, although one U.S. official said that the CIA never completely left. The CIA initially predicted that Kiev would fall quickly to Russia. If you remember, that was what the U.S. intelligence was saying, that Russia would kind of steamroll in. But after it became clear that wasn't happening, the Biden administration sent its covert assets back into Ukraine. The report said that U.S. clandestine operations inside Ukraine are, quote, now far more extensive than they were early in the war, when U.S. intelligence officials were fearful that Russia would steamroll over the Ukrainian army, end quote. Several current and former intelligence officials said that there is a much larger presence of both CIA and U.S. special operations personnel and resources in Ukraine than there were at the time of the Russian invasion in February. So back in June, the New York Times reported that there was a CIA presence in Ukraine, but it made no mention of U.S. Special Operations Forces. The New York Times report did say that several U.S. allies have special operations troops in Ukraine, including Britain, France, Canada, and Lithuania. So this, to my knowledge, and I could have missed something, but I think this is the first time that there's U.S. officials telling the media that there's a U.S. Special Operations Forces on the ground in Ukraine. Now, it doesn't say what they're doing, because the focus of this article was how the CIA got their initial assessment wrong. and it was just kind of about all these claims from the CIA about how corruption in the Russian military is why they didn't advance as well. This was kind of buried, like this wasn't the headline, but this is the big scoop from this report. Um, so the report said that the covert operations inside Ukraine are being conducted under a covert presidential finding that indicates President Biden has quietly notified Congress of a broad program of clandestine operations inside the country. It's not clear what the personnel are doing, as I said, or where exactly they are operating, but the presence risks provoking Russia. The covert operations contradict President Biden's pledge not to send troops into Ukraine. And he said before, when he was asked, this was before the invasion, if he would send U.S. troops into Ukraine just to evacuate U.S. personnel. He said no, because that could spark a world war. Well, here you are sending special operations forces in there. Yeah, so this is a huge story. I haven't seen anybody pick it up besides I saw somebody tag me in something on Twitter. It was a Substack that wrote about it. But I mean, when it comes to the mainstream outlets, I haven't seen this picked up anywhere. Nobody seems to care. And again, this is kind of a source that normally I wouldn't cite, but I think, I mean, I don't see any reason why these U.S. officials would, lie about this. I think it's true. But yeah, so I mean, U.S. troops are on the ground in Ukraine. But anyway, I want to take a moment to mention that it's our fundraiser. As I've been discussing all week, we need our readers to donate. That's how we get by. We don't have any corporate sponsors. We're entirely reader funded and now listener funded, because we got a podcast now that you're listening to. And that's, this is antiwar.com's podcast. Without them giving me this job to write all the stories that I do, I wouldn't be able to do this. So if you appreciate the show, please chip in and donate. You go to antiwar.com/donate to do that. And right now, if you look, we have a little meter at the top of the page. We got to get to 80,000. We're getting close to 10,000. So it's been a good week. We got to keep going. We have a letter from Noam Chomsky up top, still at the page. He says, I mean, I still can't believe some of these quotes, because he's talking about the news coverage, which is me. He says he reads antiwar.com regularly because it has served as a reliable source for news on a daily basis, independent and unfiltered. I hope you will join me in supporting this unflinching source for the truth. So yeah, donate to antiwar.com so we could finish the fundraiser and I could stop telling you about it. So I could just focus on the news coverage. Okay, so the next one here. This is from the New York Times. This is a very interesting report. It has kind of a strange headline, but it says that the State Department has been fast-tracking private arms sales to Ukraine. These are private citizens that are selling weapons to the Ukrainian government. And it talks about this couple, this American couple that was making a deal to sell $30 million worth of rockets, grenade launchers, and ammunition to the Ukrainian military. So they say in just it looks like the State Department has authorized more than $300 million in private deals to Ukraine, which is nothing compared to the over $17 billion in weapons the U.S. has shipped or promised. But still, that's pretty significant. $300 million in private weapon sales. And as this is actually a good report, it says, the private sales, there's more of a risk for them to end up on the black market and stuff. The next story here, Swedish probe of Nord Stream leaks points to serious sabotage. So the Sweden's domestic security agency said Thursday that its initial probe into the leaks in the Nord Stream natural gas pipelines has strengthened the suspicions of serious sabotage. So at this point, there's little doubt that this incident was the result of an attack, but that was just affirmed by the Sweden's security service. They said they found that detonations caused extensive damage to Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. Germany's federal police, the BKA, they also said this week that the leaks were a result of an attack, and they said it was likely carried out by a state actor. Now, why do you have these investigations going on? Nord Stream AG, there's a operator for each pipeline, Nord Stream AG and Nord Stream 2 AG, and both of them have said that authorities Swedish and Danish authorities, because where the blasts happened were they were technically international waters in the Baltic Sea, but they were within the exclusive economic zone of Sweden and Denmark. So Swedish and Danish authorities are not letting, Nord Stream AG, the operator, inspect their own pipeline. They say in one scenario they have to get a permit that could take 20 days, and then in the other one, they have to wait until the police investigation is done. So you got the U.S. allies here doing the investigation, and still, it's just not clear who was behind the attacks. And as I've covered pretty extensively, I think that the U.S. has the motive, certainly has the motive more so than Russia. And that doesn't necessarily mean the U.S. did it, but they have a reason to do it. And if they did do it, I would guess that they probably separated themselves from it, that they had somebody else do it, maybe. I don't know, but we still don't know. But of course, Antony Blinken said it was a tremendous opportunity to get Europe off Russian gas. Biden has previously threatened to put an end to Nord Stream 2. So this idea that it's a conspiracy theory, that the AP recently had a story calling these claims a baseless conspiracy theory, that's just nonsense. That article made no mention of the fact that the U.S. has been trying to stop Nord Stream 2 for years and years. But again, I'll let you guys do the speculating on that. Okay. The next one, this is very interesting. This is from our friend Kelly Vlahos at Responsible Statecraft. She wrote us a fundraiser letter recently, a very good one if you want to check that out too. But Democrats propose a full break from Saudi Arabia and the UAE after OPEC's hostile act. So OPEC, as I went over yesterday, they said they're going to reduce oil production by 2 million barrels. And, this comes right before midterm elections. They're looking at it as a hostile act against Biden and I guess the Democrats too. So three members of the House, Democrats, Tom Malinowski from New Jersey, Sean Casten from Illinois, and Susan Ellis Wild from Pennsylvania, they introduced a bill that would take all U.S. troops, weapons, and missile defense systems out of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So I like how Kelly put this, so I'll read what she said. It seems OPEC's major snub to the Biden administration has done what the war in Yemen and the murder of Jamal Khashoggi could not: get members of Congress mad enough to call for the dissolution of the entire relationship with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. So she makes a good point there because, of course, the Khashoggi murder, that has generated plenty of outrage, but the war in Yemen, which is one of the most brutal wars that's been going on, that's just been killing innocent civilians and children, starving them to death because of the blockade and bombing campaign. That's not enough. But to be fair, there are a lot of Democrats in Congress that are actually trying to co-sponsoring this bill to end the war. They still haven't had a vote on it yet, which I don't understand, but maybe this could get that bill going. So, I mean, it's unlikely that this bill introduced by 3 members of the House will get very far, but it does show that how angry the Democrats are. I think it's very interesting. And the next one is related. The U.S. envoy to Yemen fears a return to war after the Yemen ceasefire expires. So Tim Lenderkin, he is Biden's special envoy for Yemen. He was supposed to find a peace deal. He hasn't had much luck. I mean, they had the 6-month ceasefire, but I don't know how involved the U.S. was really in negotiating that. But anyway, Lenderkin, he warned that there will be a return to war in Yemen if a deal isn't reached. And he accused the Houthis of making maximalist demands. So he's blaming it on the Houthis. The Houthis rejected what he said. Basically, it seems like one of the major sticking points is over the payment of salaries for Yemeni civil workers, government workers, and stuff. And according to this, the reports I've read, both sides want them to get paid, they're saying. And Lenderkin accused the Houthis of insisting that payments should first go to their military and security personnel. But according to the Cradle, the Houthis have only criticized, they weren't happy with the proposed plan that would have excluded police and security and military employees from also getting paid. So apparently they're not saying pay them first, they're saying just also pay them. But who knows exactly what was going on in the negotiations. But Mohammed Ali al Houthi, he's a Houthi official, he wrote on Twitter that the Houthis' demands for further ceasefire talks were not, how he put it, was extremism. That's the translation from Arabic, but he's referring to what Lender King said, accusing them of making maximalist demands. And he says it's not extremism to lift the siege on Yemen, because another major demand, precondition that the Houthis have had for talks, for real talks, like to end the war, is to lift the blockade. Under the ceasefire, the blockade was eased somewhat, but they haven't lifted it fully. And a group of 38 members of Congress recently sent a letter to Biden this week urging him to pressure Saudi Arabia to lift the blockade. So that's the thing. I mean, if Lender King and the Biden administration really want this war to end, they have the power to do it. They can just cut off support to the Saudi coalition, which is entirely reliant on U.S. maintenance, their air force. But so far, there haven't been any Saudi airstrikes in Yemen since the ceasefire expired. And it does seem like there's a little back and forth going on, like there's some kind of negotiations. But again, those war powers resolutions to end U.S. support for the war are really important. And you could call 1-833-STOP-WAR to tell your representative and senator to sponsor and support those pieces of legislation. But al-Houthi, he also warned that the Houthis could start launching attacks again on Saudi territory, because that's something that would definitely lead to more to Saudi airstrikes starting up again. Okay. So the next one here, one person killed in a rare U.S. raid in Syrian government-controlled territory. So U.S. Special Operations Forces launched a raid in Syria, and it was in Syrian government-controlled territory, which is very rare. According to Al Jazeera, it's the first known such raid, although I'm sure earlier in the war there was special operations going on in government-controlled areas. But in recent years, it's definitely the first one that's been reported in a while. But U.S. Central Command said that the raid was carried out overnight in the city of Qamishli, and it targeted an ISIS member, according to CENTCOM. They said that it killed Rakan Wahid al-Shamri, who they said was an ISIS member accused of helping the group smuggle weapons. But there was some reports that gave a different name for the person that was killed. The newspaper Al Arabi Al Jadid reported that a person with a different name was killed. Sorry, I just said that. And a source told the newspaper that this person was named Abu Hale, who was accused of collaborating with ISIS, and was killed after refusing to surrender to U.S. forces. And then later on Thursday, CENTCOM said that it carried out airstrikes in northern Syria. It didn't specify where, and they claimed that 2 ISIS leaders were killed in the strikes. So while I was writing about the raid right before I recorded this, I saw that CENTCOM put that release out. So I haven't really seen reports on it, what people on the ground are saying happened, because we know that the Pentagon is notorious for undercounting civilian casualties, and they can get it wrong a lot. They say they killed ISIS people, but they killed civilians, really. So we don't really know exactly what happened on the ground yet in that situation. But the current situation in Syria, when it comes to the U.S. occupation, they have about 900 troops stationed in eastern Syria. The U.S. backs Kurdish forces in the region, allowing Washington to control about 1/3 of the country's territory. And that's an area where most of Syria's oil resources are. The Syrian government is strongly opposed to the U.S. occupation and called for U.S. forces to leave during the recent UN General Assembly in New York. On top of the occupation, the U.S. maintains crippling economic sanctions on Syria that are designed to prevent the country's reconstruction. Blinken has said that. They're brutal sanctions. There's a dire humanitarian situation going on in the country, but they're keeping these sanctions on. They don't want the country to rebuild. So Yeah, we'll probably get more about these airstrikes. But yeah, it looks, the U.S. These are ISIS. They're not even saying really that they're high level ISIS officials, ISIS leaders or whatever. They're just killing these kind of seem like low level people. But that's what they're saying. Who they're saying they're killing. Okay, so the next one, North Korea warplanes fly near the South Korean border. Okay, so this is from Kyle Anzalone and Will Porter, and I think this story has been pretty dynamic throughout the day because it's just tit for tat escalation. North Korea launches a missile, the U.S. and South Korea they launch some missiles, they do big uh, um, war games and stuff. So this was on Thursday. North Korea flew 12 warplanes near its border with South Korea, prompting the South to scramble dozens of fighter jets in response. Meanwhile, Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo conducted joint war games. So tensions just keep rising in this situation, and it doesn't seem like this is going to change anytime soon. So hopefully, this doesn't lead to anything major. The next one here, this is another one from our friends at the Libertarian Institute, Kyle and Connor Freeman. It says that a growing number of Americans want diplomacy with adversaries. According to a new survey of Americans, a growing majority desire negotiations with Washington's enemies. For example, nearly 80% of people polled said that they want the White House to continue nuclear talks with Iran. So, I mean, that's pretty good. This is from the Eurasia Group Foundation, and they usually do pretty um, extensive polling. So I think hopefully this is an accurate representation of what people are thinking. That because diplomacy is good. That's what we want to see. But that's it for the news. We have a lot of good viewpoints. As always, we have one from Jonathan Cook about the Nord Stream attacks, and it's a pretty good overview of kind of the evidence that points to the U.S. And again, we don't know, but his the title is "Can Europe Afford to Turn a Blind Eye to Evidence of a U.S. Role in the Pipeline Blasts?" So it's interesting. But that's it for me for today. I'll be back after the weekend with some more news. Go to handsofassange.com if you want to see if there's a protest near you, or if you could travel. It would be great to get to DC. If you're in the UK, go to London. They're surrounding British Parliament. It's just a really big day of action for Julian Assange. And there's going to be a lot of stuff online. I think they might be streaming the protest and the speeches where I'm going to speak in DC. So just keep it on my Twitter because I'll tweet all that stuff out over the weekend if that's what's going down. But yeah, support us, antiwar.com/donate. There's a lot of other stuff I should tell you to do, but that's it for me for today. I'll talk to you after the weekend. Thank you.